Moving to a new town was supposed to be a fresh start. The small, isolated community in the middle of nowhere felt eerie from the beginning. As I drove into town on a chilly December evening, only a few dim lights scattered across the streets. Most of the stores were closed, and the empty sidewalks made me feel like I was entering a ghost town. The silence was unsettling, and as I pulled up to my new house, the feeling intensified. Unloading my belongings, I noticed how the house seemed different from the photos. Shadows filled the corners, and the worn wooden floors creaked under my weight. Every sound echoed, heightening the feeling of isolation. The air smelled stale, as if the place hadn't been lived in for years. I brushed off the unease, attributing it to my exhaustion from the move. After setting up a temporary mattress on the floor, I lay down, hoping for a good night's rest. The silence inside felt deafening, only interrupted by the occasional groan of the old house settling. I tried to close my eyes, but every creak and shift in the wood seemed amplified in the dark. My mind played tricks, making me feel like I wasn't alone. A sudden creak in the hallway snapped me out of my thoughts. It sounded like footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving toward my room. Sitting up, I strained my ears, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But as the sounds grew closer, my heart raced, pounding against my chest. Frozen in place, I watched as a faint shadow passed just outside my door, visible through the small gap at the bottom. Holding my breath, I waited for it to move, but it lingered, casting an eerie silhouette. The realization hit me. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was standing outside my room. Forcing myself to move, I crept toward the door, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was there. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, unsure if I truly wanted to open it. A deep, sinking feeling took over as I thought about who or what might be on the other side. Before I could turn the handle, the shadow slipped away, disappearing down the hall. I quickly opened the door and peered out, but the corridor was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the darkness, but no movement, no sound, nothing but the quiet hum of silence. Trying to shake off the fear, I told myself it was my imagination. Returning to bed, I closed my eyes, though sleep was a distant hope. Just as I felt myself drifting off, another noise, this time closer, jerked me awake. A low, guttural whisper echoed from the hallway, filling me with dread. Panic set in as the whisper grew louder, almost as if it were right next to me. My mind raced with explanations, each one more terrifying than the last. Who was in my house? Why were they whispering? I sat up, clutching the edge of the mattress, feeling utterly alone and defenseless. In the silence, footsteps echoed once more, moving through the house. The weight of each step pressed down on me, making it feel like the walls were closing in. My instincts told me to leave, to run, but fear kept me rooted in place, unsure of what would happen if I left the room. Summoning courage, I decided to check the front door, thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. I crept down the hallway, heart pounding. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I couldn't recall if I'd left it that way or if someone had tried to enter. As I stood there, a shadow appeared just outside, blocking the dim light. It was the same figure, standing motionless, watching me. The figure seemed more defined now, the shape of a man in old, ragged clothing. His face remained obscured, yet I felt his stare. Suddenly the figure moved, stepping into the light, revealing a hollow, ghostly expression. My body froze as his lips twisted into a chilling smile. In that instant, I realized this was no ordinary intruder. His presence was unnatural, something from beyond. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the door, throwing it open and running outside. Looking back, I saw the figure standing in the doorway, his eyes fixated on me as he slowly faded into darkness. The house seemed to breathe, exhaling a sense of relief as he vanished. I never returned to that house. The owner later told me it had been abandoned for years, the previous tenant having fled after reporting similar hauntings. To this day, the shadow remains a mystery, but I know it was waiting for something or someone to claim. Moving to the outskirts of town had felt like a fresh start. A quiet neighborhood with a slow pace, It seemed like the perfect place to settle down. But there was something eerie about the house. Shadows clung to the corners, and the silence felt unnaturally thick. From the very first night, a sense of unease crept over me, though I couldn't put my finger on why. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a knock echoed through the empty hallways. Expecting a friendly neighbor or a delivery, I opened the door. Standing there was a man, perhaps in his 50s, with hollow eyes and an unsettling, almost blank expression. He greeted me with a stiff nod but said nothing, just stared with an unnerving intensity. Feeling obligated, I attempted small talk, asking if he lived nearby. His response was delayed, as if he was considering how to answer. Finally, he nodded slowly, mumbling, "Just checking in." Without further explanation, he turned and walked away. Confused, I watched him disappear down the path, feeling oddly rattled by the encounter. The next evening, a similar knock startled me just as I was settling in. Opening the door, I found the same man standing there, with the same empty stare. He didn't speak, just kept looking at me, unblinking. It was unnerving, like he was studying me. Again, he eventually turned and left without a word. Days passed, and his visits became a nightly ritual. Every evening, he would knock, stand there for a moment, then leave. I began dreading the sound of his knock. The eerie silence that followed his departure left an unsettling weight in the air, as if he had taken a part of the atmosphere with him. One evening, growing tired of the strange routine, I decided I would confront him and ask why he kept coming. I waited by the door as his knock sounded, then quickly opened it. He stood there, hands at his sides, his face blank as ever. "Why do you keep coming here?" I demanded, trying to hide my growing unease. His reply was barely a whisper. "Just checking," he repeated, his gaze never wavering. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as he continued to stare, his eyes seeming to bore into me. When I closed the door, I could still feel his presence lingering outside, as if he hadn't truly left. That night, sleep was elusive. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my room, and every creak of the house felt amplified. The image of his empty gaze haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. My mind raced, filled with thoughts of who he was and why he was drawn to my house. The following day, I spoke with neighbors, casually asking if they'd seen the man. Their blank expressions and dismissive replies confirmed my suspicion. No one else had seen him. It was as if he only appeared for me, which only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Another night arrived, and his knock echoed through the house as usual. This time, something metallic glinted from his sleeve as he reached up. The light caught on it, revealing what looked like the edge of a blade. My heart raced as I slammed the door, locking it immediately. Without warning, he began pounding on the door, each hit more violent than the last. My hands trembled as I backed away, listening to the relentless banging. "Open up!" he hissed, his voice muffled but unmistakable. Fear seized me as I realized he was no longer a harmless neighbor. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher about the man outside. As I spoke, the pounding stopped. I waited in silence, straining to hear anything on the other side of the door. Finally, I heard footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. Police arrived within minutes, but the man was long gone. They checked the neighborhood, speaking to other residents. Oddly, not one neighbor could recall ever seeing him. I described his face and empty gaze, but they shrugged, telling me no one like that lived nearby. One officer advised installing security cameras. I followed his advice, hoping it would bring peace of mind. As I reviewed the footage each night, I found nothing. Days passed, and the strange man never returned, leaving me with a haunting sense of unanswered questions. Months later, I learned the previous tenant had also reported a strange, silent figure visiting each night, only to vanish into thin air. The mystery remains unsolved, and I often wonder if he's still out there, waiting to find someone new to haunt. Starting fresh in a new house with my best friend felt like an adventure. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, with the occasional streetlight casting shadows on empty sidewalks. The first night, an odd feeling settled over me, a sense of being watched, though I brushed it off as nerves. We were both excited and a little anxious about this new chapter, unaware of the unsettling events that were about to unfold. Late at night, while unpacking, I glanced out the window and saw a figure standing on the sidewalk across the street. A woman, barely visible in the dim light, was staring directly at our house. Her posture was rigid, her face obscured by darkness, yet I felt her gaze fixed on me. I turned away, trying to ignore the unsettling image, hoping she'd disappear by morning. The following night, the woman appeared again. She stood in the exact same spot, her silhouette outlined against the faint glow of a street lamp. This time I nudged my friend, pointing her out. He laughed it off, saying she was probably just a passerby. But deep down, I knew something was off. Her presence felt too deliberate, as though she were waiting for something. Days passed, and the unsettling sightings continued. I began to dread nightfall, fearing that I'd see her again. Each time she stood there, unmoving, her gaze fixed on our house. A growing sense of dread filled me, but I kept quiet, hoping my friend wouldn't think I was overreacting. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching for a reason. One evening, I returned home later than usual. As I parked the car, my headlights briefly illuminated the figure once more. She didn't flinch or turn away. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I walked to the door. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, heart pounding as I struggled to comprehend her relentless presence. Inside, the house felt oppressively quiet. I called out for my friend, but there was no answer. I checked the rooms, growing more anxious with each empty space I encountered. Finally, I reached his bedroom and saw the closet door slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I whispered his name, and to my relief, he responded from inside, his voice shaky. He emerged, looking pale and frightened. "She was here," he whispered, eyes wide with fear. He explained how he'd heard the door creak open and footsteps echo through the house. By the time he realized someone was inside, she had already turned off all the lights and moved silently through the rooms, as if searching. I felt a cold sweat break out as he described her movements. She had drifted from room to room, pausing outside his door as if listening, then continued down the hallway. He hid in the closet, too afraid to confront her, praying she wouldn't find him. The thought of her quietly roaming our home sent chills down my spine. After hearing his account, I decided we needed help. I called the police, feeling both relieved and terrified when I hung up. As we waited, every creak of the house seemed amplified, as if she might reappear at any moment. The oppressive silence weighed down on us, making every minute feel like an eternity. The police arrived, searched the house, and found no sign of her. They assured us we were safe, yet something in their faces betrayed doubt. One officer suggested that perhaps we'd imagined it, but the other looked at me with a knowing expression, as if sensing there was more to this than met the eye. Feeling uneasy, I asked the officers if any other neighbors had seen a woman nearby. They shook their heads, explaining that none of the neighbors recognized our description. It was as if she were a phantom, appearing only for us. My mind reeled with questions, each one darker than the last. We installed additional locks and bolted the windows, hoping to keep her out. Despite our precautions, sleep was elusive. Every sound outside made us jump, imagining her standing just beyond the door, waiting for her chance. The feeling of safety was gone, replaced by a haunting sense of dread. One night, just as I was drifting off, a shadow appeared outside the window. My breath caught as I recognized her outline, staring in from the darkness. She didn't move or blink, her gaze unbroken. I froze, unwilling to breathe, terrified she would find a way inside. By morning, she was gone, leaving no trace of her presence. My friend and I agreed we couldn't stay any longer. The terror had become too much to bear. We packed hastily, leaving behind the memories and the dread that had settled into every corner of the house. Months later, I heard rumors that a woman had been seen watching another house in the neighborhood. The thought chilled me. Her obsession wasn't limited to us. She was still out there, searching, haunting. Some mysteries never fade, lingering like shadows in the night. Settling into a secluded house nestled deep in the forest felt like stepping into a dream. Surrounded by towering trees and breathing in the fresh, crisp air, we anticipated peace and solitude. Yet, from the very first night, an unshakable sense of unease began to creep in. Shadows seemed to shift and dance outside while an oppressive silence hung over the house, as if the forest concealed secrets it wasn't ready to share. Late that night, just as we were drifting off to sleep, a faint, haunting melody floated in through the open window. The sound was old, filled with static, like it was coming from an ancient radio. At first we thought it was a neighbor or perhaps just our imagination. But as the minutes passed, the music grew clearer and closer, filling the house with a sense of foreboding. Curiosity got the better of us, and my husband decided to investigate. He slipped on his shoes and grabbed a flashlight, giving me a reassuring smile before stepping outside. The forest was eerily still, with only the faint melody echoing through the trees. As he moved further into the yard, the music grew louder, as though leading him toward something waiting in the darkness. Following the sound, he found an old, rusted radio lying in the grass, playing the haunting tune. Confused, he looked around, trying to make sense of how this radio appeared in our yard. Just as he reached down to turn it off, he noticed movement at the edge of the forest. 3 figures stood there, cloaked in shadow, watching him intently. Heart racing, he backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on the shadowy figures. They remained motionless, just watching, as though they were waiting for something. Panic set in, and he turned and sprinted back to the house, slamming the door shut behind him. I could see the terror in his eyes as he locked every door and window, his hands shaking. As he recounted what he'd seen, a chill ran down my spine. It sounded like something out of a nightmare, yet the fear in his voice told me it was all too real. Every creak, every rustle outside sent shivers through me. The forest, once serene, now felt alive, watching us, hiding secrets in its shadows. The next day we decided to call the police, hoping for some rational explanation. Officers arrived, inspected the yard, and checked the surrounding area. Yet they found nothing. No footprints, no radio, and certainly no sign of the mysterious figures. They assured us it was probably just a prank, though their expressions hinted at unease. After the officers left, we felt a brief sense of relief, though the fear lingered. As night fell, the oppressive silence returned, more suffocating than before. Every crackle of the fire, every whisper of wind made us jump. We huddled together, each of us silently hoping that the strange events were over. Around midnight, the haunting music returned, louder and clearer than before. It seemed to echo from all directions, surrounding us, trapping us within its sinister melody. We froze, listening as the eerie tune filled every corner of the house. There was no radio this time, only the relentless music drifting from the forest. My husband grabbed a flashlight, his face set with determination. He wasn't going to let fear control us any longer. Against my pleas, he stepped outside, scanning the darkness with the beam of light. I watched from the window, my heart pounding as he disappeared into the shadows, the music growing louder with each step he took. He reached the edge of the forest, his light flickering as though struggling against an unseen force. Shadows seemed to stretch and contort around him, obscuring his figure. I watched helplessly as the darkness swallowed him whole. The music reached a crescendo, its eerie notes piercing the night, drowning out my desperate calls for him to come back. Moments later, he stumbled back into the yard, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "They're watching," he gasped, barely able to speak. He described the feeling of eyes on him from all directions, an overwhelming sense of being surrounded. He had seen glimpses of figures moving among the trees, always just out of reach. We retreated inside, locking every door and window. The music faded, but the feeling of being watched remained. We sat in silence, gripping each other's hands, knowing we weren't alone. The forest, once our haven, had become a prison filled with unseen watchers, waiting for a moment to strike. Over the next few days, strange sounds echoed around our property. We heard whispers, laughter, and footsteps that stopped as soon as we approached. Each night, the music would return, echoing in the silence, a haunting reminder that we were never truly alone. The figures never appeared again, yet their presence lingered, an oppressive weight pressing on us. Eventually, we decided to leave, unable to endure the endless nights filled with fear. But even now, miles away from that house, the haunting melody sometimes drifts through my dreams, accompanied by shadows watching from the trees. Some things, it seems, refuse to let go. Moving into my first home felt like a milestone, a step toward independence. The quaint house stood on a quiet street, surrounded by towering trees. It was everything I had hoped for, peaceful and secluded. But that first night, an odd sense of unease crept over me. The silence felt too heavy, as if the house held secrets it wasn't ready to reveal. I dismissed the feeling, convincing myself it was just my nerves settling into a new place. Late that evening, as I lay in bed, a faint creaking sound drifted from the stairs. At first, I thought it was the wood settling. The house was old after all. But as the sound grew louder and closer, my curiosity turned to anxiety. The noise became unmistakable, footsteps slow and deliberate coming up the staircase. My heart pounded and I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps paused midway up the stairs, lingering for a moment as if someone were contemplating the next move. Chills ran down my spine as the silence stretched on. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, the footsteps resumed, growing louder as they approached the top of the staircase. Bracing myself, I got out of bed, clutching a flashlight. With each step I took, the wooden floor creaked beneath me. Peering into the hallway, I saw nothing but shadows stretching across the walls. I convinced myself it was just the old house playing tricks on me, and after a moment of hesitation, I returned to bed. Sleep, however, did not come easily. A few nights later, the footsteps returned, this time louder and more insistent. They began the moment I turned off the lights, moving slowly up the stairs with a deliberate pace. I sat up, gripped by an overwhelming sense of dread. I could no longer ignore it. Someone or something was in my house. The thought made my blood run cold. Gathering my courage, I crept down the stairs, flashlight in hand. The beam illuminated the empty hallway, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with me. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs, a man wearing a mask, standing motionless, as if waiting. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The masked man took a step toward me, and instinctively, I shouted for him to leave. He didn't respond, just tilted his head as if studying me. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of his breathing. My hands shook, but I held my ground, demanding he leave before things escalated. To my surprise, he backed away slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. He turned and walked out the front door, disappearing into the night. I quickly locked the door, my mind racing with questions. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived, as a faint tapping sound began echoing from the windows around the house. Heart pounding, I checked each window, locking them and peering out into the darkness. Shadows seemed to shift outside, and every creak felt like an ominous sign. I called the police, explaining the strange encounter. They assured me they'd send someone immediately, but waiting alone was torturous. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps outside. I held my breath, praying that help would arrive soon. Every second stretched into an eternity, the noises circling the house, like something trying to find a way in. Fear gripped me, and I wondered if the masked man had returned with a partner. When the police finally arrived, I ran to meet them, explaining everything in a rush. They combed through the house and the surrounding area, finding no one. The masked man had vanished without a trace, and no sign of a second intruder was found. The officers reassured me but shared concerned glances, as though they sensed something was wrong. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and at night, faint noises echoed through the house. Each creak felt like a reminder that my home was no longer a sanctuary. The masked man and his possible accomplice haunted my thoughts. One evening, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. My heart raced, fear gripping me as the noise drew closer. The police had found nothing, yet the sounds persisted, as though someone had never really left. I sat up, clutching the covers, waiting for the inevitable. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs just outside my door. Silence followed, thick and oppressive, as if daring me to open the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, hesitating. A sense of dread washed over me, a whisper in the back of my mind warning me not to open it, but curiosity tugged at me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I opened the door, only to find an empty hallway. Relief was short-lived, though, as I caught sight of a faint shadow moving at the end of the hall, disappearing into the darkness. The realization hit me hard. My home would never be the same, and the sense of safety I once felt was forever shattered. Stepping into my new home alone felt like a fresh chapter, a real taste of independence. The quiet suburban neighborhood seemed perfect, promising peace and solitude. But that first night, an uneasy feeling crept in. The silence felt dense, almost as if the house itself was watching, holding its breath along with me. I brushed it off as nerves, hoping to settle in soon. But the sensation lingered, a subtle nagging feeling that something was amiss, something lurking just beyond what I could see. A few days later, strange noises began coming from above. Faint scratching sounds echoed from the attic, followed by soft thumps, as if something or someone was moving around. My rational mind wanted to believe it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon. But every night the sounds grew louder, persistent, as though they were coming closer to the entrance to the attic. One evening, curiosity got the best of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, each step creaking under my weight. The musty smell intensified as I approached the door. Pausing to listen, I swore I heard soft breathing from the other side. My heart raced, but I couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door, and my flashlight illuminated a dusty, dark space. Scattered across the attic were piles of old furniture and forgotten belongings, all cloaked in thick layers of dust. As I swept the flashlight around, a faint glimmer caught my eye. A small, worn-out mattress tucked away in the corner, partially hidden by a stack of boxes. A chill ran down my spine as I approached, realizing that someone had been sleeping here recently. Beneath the mattress, I found wrappers from snacks, crumpled blankets, and even a tattered notebook. My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages, revealing erratic scribbles and chilling phrases like, "I watch you sleep," scrawled over and over. The horrifying realization set in. Someone had been living here, watching me. Frozen in fear, I backed away, only to hear footsteps echoing from below. Someone was in the house. I quickly descended the stairs, my hands shaking, my breath shallow and rapid. Desperation flooded over me as I tried to comprehend the reality. This person wasn't just in the attic. They were moving freely throughout my home. Grabbing my phone, I dialed the police, struggling to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. The operator assured me help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. I huddled in the living room, listening to every creak and whisper, waiting for any sign that the intruder was coming closer. Just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the police arrived, lights flashing outside. I ran to the door, waving them in and pointing them toward the attic. They moved swiftly, weapons drawn, disappearing up the stairs. Moments later, I heard scuffling, muffled screams, and then silence as they led her down, handcuffed. The girl was young, perhaps in her 20s, her face pale and gaunt, eyes wide with a haunting emptiness. She looked at me as they escorted her out, and a shiver ran through me. There was no remorse, no fear, only a cold, calculating stare that made my skin crawl. It was as though she took satisfaction in what she'd done. After they left, I wandered back up to the attic, needing to understand how she had survived unnoticed. Hidden behind some boxes was a small, secret door leading to a cramped, dark room. Inside, I found more blankets, food wrappers, and a tiny peephole drilled into the floorboards directly above my bedroom. Horrified, I knelt down, looking through the peephole. My bed lay directly beneath it, clear as day. She had been watching me, silently observing my every move as I slept, completely unaware of her presence. The full weight of the invasion crashed over me, filling me with dread and disgust. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak and groan in the house felt like a warning, a reminder of the chilling reality that someone had lived above me, unseen yet ever present. I lay awake, haunted by the knowledge that I had never truly been alone. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, plagued by a sense of paranoia. I double-checked every lock, closed every curtain, and avoided the attic. But no matter what I did, the feeling of being watched lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. Friends tried to reassure me, telling me that she was gone and I was safe. Yet no words could erase the image of her face staring back at me, or the knowledge that I had been a source of her twisted fascination. A part of me feared she'd return, drawn back to the house where she had been a silent ghost in my life. Every night since, as I lay in bed, I can't help but glance at the ceiling, imagining her eyes watching me from above. The peace I once sought in this home is gone, replaced by an unease that I can't escape. I know now that the horror wasn't just her presence, but the haunting knowledge that I was never truly alone.